Welcome, everyone. My name is Matt Grotenstein. Thank you for joining us today. I am the Vice President of Client Development here at Acclaro. Today, we're going to be talking about building multilingual websites that drive revenue. I'm joined today by our Director of Operations, Lydia Clark, and one of our partners, Florian Auchenthaler, who is the owner of the digital agency, DesigningIT. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping notes I wanted to go over. First, please note that all attendees are in listen-only mode. To test your audio, click on Audio Settings in your console. To ask questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A tab and ask your question and hit the Send button. We'll get to most of those towards the end of the session. Any questions we do not get to, we will answer during one of our follow-up sessions. Also, we've disabled chat for this webinar, so please use the Q&A tabs for your questions. Lastly, we're recording the webinar, and an on-demand version will be shared with you via a follow-up email. Let's talk a little bit about today's agenda. We will be talking about why you would build a multilingual website. We'll be addressing language and country targeting. We'll talk a little bit about evaluating CMS systems. We'll also talk about building and managing global brand consistency. We'll talk about SEO considerations and user experience choices and options. And then finally, we'll wrap up with the Q&A. Before we start, for those of you who are not familiar with Acclaro, we are a 16-year-old language service provider founded in 2002. We have a full-time team of 75 language professionals that are located across our 7 global offices. We have a network of 4,500 translators that are all subject matter experts in their language and particular field. We serve our clients in over 100 core languages. The vast majority of our work is around website, software, multimedia, and document translation. And while we are experts in the translation aspects of delivering a multilingual website, we have partners like Florian at DesigningIT that are experts in designing and building these sites. So on that note, I will turn it over to Florian.
Hey, thanks, Matt. So a few words about DesigningIT, which is a full-service digital marketing agency that was started in 2003. We now have a full-time team of 13 with the headquarters in Charleston, South Carolina, and a presence in Europe. Really the reason why we exist is to help people grow their businesses into new locations, into new countries, and into new languages. And let's make no mistake, digital marketing really can be an expensive endeavor, and it's oftentimes confusing and challenging, especially if you're trying to go across cultures and across languages and across countries. And for this reason, I'm super excited to have partnered with the team at Acclaro here to create this webinar in order to provide just a little bit more clarity around how this process of creating a multilingual website works from the perspective of both the language side as well as the perspective of the website building and design side. So let's maybe dive in and start with a basic look at why companies might consider creating a multilingual website to begin with. The biggest reason, at least in my opinion, the biggest reason to add more languages or expand regionally really is to grow your customer base, to gain some more market share and ultimately grow revenue, right? Other maybe secondary reasons might be things like your home market getting too competitive, maybe simply for the fact that your customers are abroad somewhere. Maybe they're local, but they speak 2 different languages. Perhaps it's just cheaper to do business overseas could be another reason. For me, at the end of the day, if there is a potential customer group that's outside of either your native language or your native country, and it does make economic sense to go after this group, then I would argue your digital global website is the best vehicle to get in front of that audience. Right? For me, the internet is the fastest growing, is the cheapest, and the most efficient marketing channel on the planet. So therefore, we want to make sure that you use this channel to find your audience, get in front of your audience, make sure that they can understand your value proposition, and then give them an easy way to do business with you. On the next two slides, we'll illustrate the importance of the internet again by showing both the growth of internet users as well as the e-commerce spend. So here on this slide, we're looking at just the growth of internet users with the relationship to world's total world population. And really, in the year 2000, we had 6%, and now in 2017, we have 51% of the world's population online. So two key items here. So one, of course, this explosive growth, but secondly, it's not over yet. We're only at 52%, right? So on the macro level, the main regions, looking back at the last 5 years, the biggest growth regions that have triple digit, I'm talking 500, 600% growth in internet users would be Southeast Asia, mostly the Philippines, Indonesia, be looking at South Africa, you're looking at India, Russia, Mexico, Middle East. These are regions that I would be definitely paying attention to. On a more micro level and individual level, when it comes to your business or your website, I would focus first, check your Google Analytics, check where traffic is coming from. You could use tools like free tools that Google provides, like Google Trends, to do a brand search or a competitor search from different countries and regions to see what the trend line looks like there. I use the 5% rule. If more than 5% of your traffic comes from a different country, I would start considering potentially localizing for this audience. Right, so the more internet users we have, it means more money is being spent online. And on that next slide, we see the B2B and B2C global e-commerce spend. The two most interesting pieces on this slide for me is again the projected growth, which is in relationship to the projected internet users coming online, and then also the fact that already in 2014, Asia Pacific outpaced the US for being the biggest e-commerce market. Today in 2018, China by far is the world's biggest e-commerce market. The thing to keep in mind here is that the internet penetration in China is only at 55%. Right? In the US, compared to the US, we're at 95%. So the key takeaway here is this growth is happening, it's continuing, and it's happening outside of the US.
Okay, we're going to stop there for one of two poll questions. Our first poll question is, what is the most important factor you considered when launching your multilingual website? It's a multiple choice question. There are 5 answers. First is web visitor data. The second is general stats on global e-commerce, internet language and usage. The third is overall business strategy. The fourth is other. And the fifth is not sure, not planning to launch a multilingual website. So please pick one, and we will take a look at the results as they come in. Okay. I'm not seeing the results on my screen, so I'll move to the next slide, and I will hand it off to Lydia from there. Oh, there they are. Okay, it looks like everyone's voted now. So the majority of people had noted overall business strategy was driving their consideration for building a multilingual website, followed by web visitor data, and that's typically what we see with our customers as well. So we will have one more poll in a few minutes, but I'll turn it over to Lydia Clark, who's going to talk about language targeting.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Matt. It's interesting that that several of you did, in fact, talk about the traffic, kind of looking at your data. We often see our clients measuring results even before, really at the beginning of their international effort on a website. They're looking at the data from the traffic on their English websites. Was it coming from a different country? And if so, using approximately that 5% rule that Florian mentioned, then there's enough interest generally to consider translating or localizing. Maybe that's not the only reason why you might want to, though. You might want to I think we're still on the previous slide actually, where you might have a product that you're localizing that you want to market in different countries. Maybe you're just targeting an international audience. You have business reasons, like many of you said. So once you've got whether you're going to develop an international website and the why you're doing it, let's think about the who, right? And the how will those international users experience that website. So the who really depends on where your target market is. What regions are you targeting? It's not just a language question, it's really also a question of region, because you could say, oh, I want a Spanish website. But are you targeting Spain? Are you targeting Latin America? Perhaps you're actually targeting Spanish speakers in the US. Those are all different variants of Spanish that would require a different target language. And this is the case for several other variants of languages, Brazilian Portuguese, for example. But there are also languages that don't, even though they are spoken in many different countries, there aren't so many variants that are super common. German is a great example. German is spoken in many different countries other than Germany. It's spoken in Switzerland, it's spoken in Italy, etc. But Swiss German and Italian German are very much less common. You could very easily translate your website into German for Germany and have it understood and be appropriate for all of those different markets. Unless there's a very specific need to go so regional, so granular, most languages you can really get away with, here's your primary variant on this language, and that can be a good target for you. You also, though, need to think about how your users will experience your international website. Will they go through a landing page? Will they automatically will you use automatic language IP targeting? Will you direct everyone to your English website and have them navigate through to your international sites via a flag system or a drop-down? And Florian will talk more about that later in the presentation. But there are lots and lots of considerations when you are thinking about your websites and how you want to target, how and who you want to target your international audiences.
All right, so before I dive into the difference between language targeting versus country targeting as it pertains to the system, I want to briefly talk about the main domain systems that exist. And on that next slide there, the two most important ones are the first two. And I know this is basic, but let's just get a quick baseline here. The first one, which is a country-coded top-level domain, has a country designation, and that means that a CCTLD is targeted to a particular country or region, but not specifically for a language. That's the important differentiator here. That's my Siri going off. Okay, so and also the country code top-level domain always has two letters in the end. So that's a way you can quickly differentiate these. The generic domain on the opposite side does not have a geographical country designation. It is neutral. It can be used by anybody for anything, basically. So if you do end up using a generic domain like the .com, like the .net, like .biz, you still have the option to manually target your generic domain to a country using the Google Search Console. I'll go into this later. So there's a few other options here for domain. I'll stick with those first two, really. In summary, country code implies that your website is designed for a particular country, whereas the generic domain implies that it's neutral. Right? And really, the first step when you make this expansion internationally, the first step for you is to figure out, well, am I targeting a language or am I targeting a country? And this impacts not only your domain structure, but other things like technical implementation and so on. from the perspective of the domain, when we were looking at country targeting here, you have three primary choices here. The country code top level domain, of course, is a main choice, and important here is to know that the search engine will automatically target this to a specific country for you. Right? That's the big consideration with the ccTLD. If you go with the route of a generic domain like Apple does, for example, you can use a subfolder and then again use the manual international targeting in the Search Console, or you can use a subdomain like, for the instance, how Facebook does here, and again you can use manual targeting with the Search Console later. So what might be the reason to go country versus language? There could be many business reasons, but maybe let me mention a few brief examples here. The most basic one might be you are a local business, right, in one country locally. However, you might have audience that speaks several languages. The case is English, Spanish here in the US. Another good example might be a French-English website in Canada. Also for international business, maybe you operate in certain countries or regions, maybe you have locations, offices there. For Apple, for instance, has their Apple stores, and it might make sense to target a region for you. Or it might be legal considerations, like for the case with PayPal here, for example, different banking systems, different regulation in each country, and so on. All right, let's take a quick look how the big companies in the world handle this digital globalization here. And on this slide, we see some statistics from a study that we did last year. And so the Forbes magazine publishes a list of the global 1,000 biggest global companies, really, which we looked at all 1,000 websites and figured out how they're doing URL structures, localization, whether they're doing country targeting versus language targeting, and so on. And what we're looking at on this slide is we checked which URL structure these businesses are using when they're country targeting their website. What we found was that 22.5% use a country code in the subfolder, 9.5% use a country code top-level domain for their country targeting, and then only 3% use a subdomain. The biggest actually is 49% using some different variation, something that's non-standard or a mix of the above, or something out of the norm, really, something that maybe you shouldn't be using, really, if you look at these two examples there in the bottom. All right, so now let's look on how language targeting works here. And the first thing you might notice here, there's only two options here. We're not seeing a country code top-level domain as a choice here, because that's country specific and therefore not ideal for generic language targeting at all. The two main options that exist here for you would be the subfolder structure, like we see here in the case of what Skype does and what Nokia does, or the subdomain structure, again, like Hilton Hotels, for example, uses this. The other recommendations here are, if you use that language shortcode, the recommended standard is the ISO 639 standard. It's a two-letter classification that's very standardly used. If you language target here, make sure you do not go into Search Console and set a region for it, right? And then instead, or in addition, you might use the hreflang tag to signal to Google which language version is appropriate. I will go into more details on hreflang there later. Now, reasons for language targeting, kind of the opposite. Maybe it's not really geographic. There's not really any local or country-specific reason for you. Typical examples might be software businesses, WordPress.com, for instance, country does language targeting. You might be a SaaS business like Airbnb. These kind of businesses typically choose language targeting. You might be a niche B2B manufacturing business that's looking to reach a bigger consumer base with language targeting, right? Because I can target all Spanish-speaking people if I do this, or all German-speaking people, rather than just targeting somebody in Switzerland, right? That's the difference here. So next, let's look at how the how our Forbes 1000 companies deal with this. So if they choose language targeting for their implementation, 74% choose a subfolder, 8.4% choose a subdomain. So in summary, regardless if you go country target or language target, the subfolder or subdirectory is the same, would be the recommended way to go. And we see this in this study, and we also would recommend this from our perspective. In most cases, there is just no compelling reason to go subdomain. There really isn't. I'll go into some SEO considerations later, but I will just leave this as a general statement. I think one more thing, if we can jump back here, yeah, one more thing I would like to just quickly consider here is that not every company, most, matter of fact, they're not born global, right? They don't start their business with hashing out their international expansion plan. That's usually not how it works. So when it comes to expanding, your existing domain oftentimes might dictate an expansion strategy for you, right? So, and typically what the consideration there is, if you already are using a country code, a top-level domain, and you're looking to expand into regions or languages, the consideration then becomes, well, do I make a domain switch away from this country domain into a more globalized, maybe a generic .com structure, or do I maybe stick with the country code and purchase 2 or 3 more country domains in the regions I'm expanding to? And switching domains always comes with risks, always is time consuming, always there's resources needed for it. So it's kind of give and take of, is it worth making the switch, yes or no? And where am I expanding to, which might also dictate this choice for you. Regardless though, if you're making this expansion choice, you do need a CMS that will power your multilingual site. And that's what Lydia is going to be talking about next here.
That's right. And for those of you who maybe don't know, a CMS stands for Content Management System, and it, among other things, these tools are used to house or host all of the content that's on your website. Surely there are many more features of a good CMS, but in this context, it's important to evaluate which CMS you're going to use. Maybe you already have one just for your English content, and then you need to evaluate whether that's suitable for an international context. Maybe you don't have one yet, and you know that it's important because you're suddenly going to go from managing one website to 5 or 10, depending on the number of languages you're going to support. A CMS can help with all of those. On the next slide, we see the logos of 4 of some very common CMSs. There are many out there. These are 4 of the most popular, and also 4 of the ones that are kind of the most international friendly, the most localization friendly. WordPress has an enormous share of the market, but all of these other ones are also popular. Also worth noting, Acclaro has connectors, has plugins for each of these CMSs. What that does is it will greatly ease the transfer of content. Essentially, it's an integration with your system to the Acclaro translation management portal. I think we're going to pause for a question here, and then I will be showing some slides that actually walk you guys through how you would use one of these CMSs in the context of localization.
Thank you, Lydia. We're going to pause here again for a quick poll. The next poll question is, what challenges have you each faced when launching your own multilingual website? Again, this poll is multiple choice. There are 4 options: lack of internal expertise on best practices, handling continuous translations, things like updates and ongoing translations, sourcing quality translations, or prioritizing content for translation. You should see a pop-up there on your screen, and you should be able to select one of those 4 options as what were the challenges that each of you faced when launching your own multilingual website. And hopefully we can look at the responses now. And the one with the most feedback was sourcing quality translation. It's interesting that that's the top option there. Followed secondly, looks like almost a tie for second between handling continuous translation, which is clearly handling updates beyond the initial push and the initial site translation. And second is prioritizing content for translation, which is also always an issue. So sourcing quality translation came up as the first option. Lydia, I will turn it back over to you.
Great, and thanks. Even before we get into this slide, I want to take a minute, though, to talk about why you might want a CMS and what happens if you don't have one. In this context, especially for those of you who are managing continuous localization, a CMS can really be helpful for avoiding the manual transfer of information, also avoiding the copy and paste. We see a lot of our clients managing website content, those that don't have a CMS, and a lot of them will manage their website content via an Excel or via a Word document that then they need to copy and paste into the various pages of their website, which really, you really do want to avoid a copy and paste scenario. It's very error prone. It does not scale. So a CMS can help you move away from copying and pasting. There is certainly a place for a CMS that may not be super internationalization ready, but it does have an import-export feature so that you can export your content that needs to be translated and import it back in to your localized sites. Really, you do want to consider whether or not your CMS or a CMS that you're considering has the ability to handle international content in various different languages, double byte, bidirectional, whatever your considerations are. There are a lot of questions to ask around choosing a CMS. I think we have some blog content around that, but let me get started on quickly walking you guys through how you would select content for translation in this example. These slides are showing the craft workflow. So here you would go in and through the Acclaro Craft Translation plugin, you would select the pages or the content that you want translated. And the next slide, you confirm, yes, in fact, those are the pieces that I do want translated. And you create an order through this module. On the next slide, you select your languages. You can see here you can select all, you can multi-select if you're trying to exclude certain languages. Those you would set up at the beginning. Obviously, you set up your languages that you can choose from. On the next slide, you add any details. You give your order a name, you request a due date, you give any instructions that you think would be relevant for your translation partner, and then on the next slide, you confirm and submit all of those. You confirm the details and submit that content for translation. Then it goes through to Acclaro or to your localization partner, and the translation is performed, right? And you can also see on the next slide, you can track the progress of any orders that you've submitted, see where it is in the process. On the Acclaro translation management portal, My Acclaro, you can see more detail about that. But even here in your own instance of Craft, you can track that progress. So once that translation is complete, on the next slide, we'll see that some of these CMSs actually have a live preview functionality. This is Craft. Drupal is rolling one of these out, I believe it's called Paragraph, very soon, if it's not already live. So many of them have a preview option, which is super helpful for translators to view the context while they're translating. They can see string by string, where is this on the page. It's also going to help with QA, because before you publish live, right, before we get to the next slide, which is about publishing, you want to consider having the content that you've had translated QA'd either on a staging site or through some sort of preview functionality like this. And different CMSs allow for different workflows here. But the idea, regardless of your workflow, is that you want to have your content translated, and then you want to allow your translators or your translation partner to QA that work in the context of the actual site. So ideally that should be either in a preview or on a staging server before you publish. And on the next slide you can see that here it's really simple, really intuitive. You click which content you are ready to publish and you click the big orange button. So it's pretty straightforward. A lot of these CMSs are very intuitive, and these plugins make it very easy to transfer content directly through to Acclaro's system, and it eases the import, the export, the transfer of translations back and forth with no copy and paste, with no manual effort. It really eases the burden on you as the owner of the multilingual website. You make the decision on what you want translated and when you want translated and when you want it translated, and your partner does the rest of the heavy lifting. One more thing to consider when you are looking at embarking on this journey of a multilingual website is your brand consistency. You have inevitably spent a crazy amount of time crafting your English message, your English look, your tone, your feel, your style. This is not something that you just one day to the next suddenly you have an English website. You've spent a lot of time on this, on the language, on the design. You don't want to lose that when you go into other markets. This is really important to consider when you're choosing how you're going to effect a multilingual website. On the next slide, we see how different options of approaching a multilingual website could affect your brand that you've spent so much time crafting. You could, if you're looking for the lowest cost option, potentially free, you could go to the crowd and you could say, okay, I'm going to open this up to whoever wants to do it out of the goodness of their heart, and you let the crowd translate your content. This is, again, very low cost, but it's also very low control. You don't have a lot of say in who does the translation at that point, what qualifications they have, what level of expertise. You have less control over what message they're actually putting out there and how your finalized content looks. So a lot of folks are looking at the crowd as a great option because it's cheap, but it really doesn't give you a whole lot of control over that brand consistency. Another option is to use freelance translators. Now this gives you a lot of control. You hire them, you fire them, right? You decide who you want to be, who is qualified to be working on your content. But it's also a lot of work to administer. You have to find these people, you have to bring them on board, you have to, or negotiate contracts with them, you have to give them the work, you have to get the work back from them, you have to manage their deadlines, etc. It's a lot of lifting on your side to manage those translators. If you're really targeting one language, this might be a good solution for you. But if instead you're looking at 10 languages, this may not be a good solution because it does allow you a lot of control, but it's a lot of work as well. Going up to the other corner, we have machine translation, which is another lower cost option. This is where an engine like a Google Translate processes your content. It's very helpful, very, very low cost. It's not the highest quality. We don't often recommend it for marketing specific content just because it's very literal. It doesn't provide a lot of nuance in the translation. And so your brand could easily get diluted or corrupted because you have much less control over the machine translation output. You can look at human post-edit as another step or even QA after that, but the baseline really doesn't allow you a lot of control. The middle ground here is a professional translation agency, someone like Acclaro or potentially a single language vendor who could manage all of the linguists and engineers and publishers and multimedia people for you. So there's less of a lift on your side, but you still maintain a critical level of control over your brand and over the output of your translated content. The next piece that I want to talk about is style guide and glossary, because regardless of what option you choose to localize your content, to process your multilingual website, you should have these pieces of reference material as critical infrastructure to your workflow. A style guide is a two-part document. One is the linguistic conventions in each target market, but the other is it lays out your style, your tone, your voice, the audience you're trying to hit, and it then adapts that for each target market. For example, if in the US you're really hip and young and cool and casual and your language reflects that, but you want to market into Japan, you really do need to take a different tone with the Japanese audience, even if your generational slice is the same, even if your generational target is the same, the language and the culture there require a different treatment. Similarly with the glossary, a glossary is a list of core vocabulary for your content, and those are key terms that you want translated in a specific way. Your partner should be developing these tools for you, the style guide and the glossary for you, and then giving you the chance to weigh in, approve those, give feedback. And once approved, once finalized, these can inform the rest of your translation. And these are really good tools to be able to maintain that brand consistency that you've worked so hard to create. Florian, you're up.
All right, thanks, Lydia. Yeah, I really need to add the Craft CMS. First of all, it's my favorite little CMS, and secondly, I was so thrilled when Acclaro created that connector to the TMS system. It was amazing. All right, so for just like you need to define tone and voice in a glossary and a style guide for language, at the same level, you need to create design templates and systems that allow your business to stay consistent across languages and regions, while give you enough flexibility to adjust for local content and local nuances. And the way we achieve this is outlined in the next slide here. So the basic linguistic reference Lydia already talked about. From there, we want to so next step would be make sure that we prepare a CMS or find a CMS that's ready for internationalization. Make sure that you use a centralized system with an appropriate access to your local team if needed. Make sure that you can prepare your database so it understands and is available, able to handle different characters. I recommend UTF-8 here for this. Make sure that your system is able to handle different formats, like the date format is usually different, currency, addresses, phones, and so forth are usually different. From a design perspective, though, we want to create what we call an international page template. And the international page template, what it means is it's a design we come up with for the reason to then localize this design later on easier. And some considerations there might be for this global design template, use your brand colors, use your brand assets, come up with a structure and a layout that's fixed and will work across regions. Provide editable regions, so you have some fixed elements on this template, but then you provide editable regions where you can customize, put different imagery, localize it, different languages and so on. I recommend keeping it simple as far as the design goes. Pay attention to the spacing. Different languages require different widths, so make sure that you have enough space for this, and usually the simpler it is, the easier for that. And then in the last step, once you localize it, you use these pages to localize the template, do your multilingual SEO on it, connect it to the translation system in your CMS, and then go ahead and transcribe your content, basically. And that's, I like it at the end there, really internationalization is what enables localization. So we got to go through this step first of creating an international template. All right, let's look at a couple of examples here. I chose Nivea here, and left is Korea, on the right is Germany, and it's a good example to just look at a international template that's localized. You can see the areas like the slider here is an editable region where they can switch out their imagery, and of course the content is translated as well. The next example would be Volvo cars. Again, very simple template, very clean, a lot of usage of imagery here, and very easy to localize this. It gives your business just some economy of scale when you have an international template like this. All right, the next example, we'll look at maybe a company that maybe did not worry so much about brand consistency here, and that's a Champion System, US-based company operating in 20-some nations worldwide. This is their US store. If we flip to the next slide here, we'll see Austria to the left, Switzerland to the right. Just it's inconsistent, first of all. Secondly, they use Shopify in the US and Magento on these two, also not a centralized way of handling it. I would go into one system, create a nice international template, and in my mind, this is cheaper for the company to maintain. It's better for the consumer, and it's better for their brand overall. So speaking about consumer, let's next look at what do we need to do so that consumers actually can find our content, right? Some SEO considerations there. In my opinion, right, the reason why we have websites, really, it should be to be able to drive enough traffic, qualified traffic to our website, and convert this traffic to complete whatever business objective we set out to have. It might be sales if we're an e-commerce store, maybe it's lead generation if you're B2B, maybe it's brand awareness, maybe engagement, maybe customer support, whatever it might be. There's numerous digital channels and strategies and tactics that will get you traffic. However, the two most fundamental to me are SEM and SEO. SEM, which stands for paid search marketing. Really, the brief thing I want to mention there is depending on your country and your industry, but roughly speaking, I would say 70% of your global paid search marketing needs can be covered by just using Facebook and Google alone, these two networks. The rest, you might need to find some specialized, more country-specific channels for you. For the purpose of this webinar, let's take a closer look at some SEO considerations here. So in terms of SEO, the general best practice SEO things that you're familiar with also apply here. However, there are some very specific things that are specific to international SEO, and picking the right URL structure is definitely one. So what structure is best? It really depends. There is not one that's better than the other. It really depends on your situation. That one might be the better fit for you. Things to consider here is the type of website you're building, e-commerce versus lead generation. Also important, like what does your brand reach look like? Are you a huge brand like Facebook and traffic maybe is not even so important? Is your company localizing and having offices in different countries? What's your target audience? What's your expansion strategy? All these things play into this. And we have examples of successful websites using all three of these domain structures here. So it really depends. Let's maybe briefly review the pros and cons of these three again. So starting with a country-coded top-level domain. The advantages are it's definitely the strongest signal to the search engine and the user as far as localization goes. It might increase your conversion rate slightly here. On the flip side, it's definitely more expensive to maintain, especially if you're in a lot of countries. And for sure, the domain authority is separate. So each country domain you use will have its own unique domain strength, right? And if you add a new country, you start from zero, basically. The next one, the subdirectory that Skype, for example, uses here, it is easier to maintain, a little bit cheaper to maintain. It shares domain strength. So you can build one global domain here, and it shares all the domain strength from your countries and languages. And you can geo-target it with Google manually if you want a country target. On the flip side, it might not be as strong of a signal, local signal to the search engine, and perhaps users might prefer a local domain, which might result in a higher conversion rate if they prefer that. The subdomain is similar to the subfolder. It lets you geo-target it if you need to. There's two main differences here, really. Maybe an advantage with the subdomain, and that's one of maybe the only ones, is that you do get a little bit more technical control over this. So for instance, one thing that you can do with a subdomain is you could use different servers to host these different subdomains. You cannot do this on the sub directory above. However, the negative here is that you do dilute your domain authority because the subdomain does not share domain strength between your websites. All right, so SEO, I mean, URL structure is definitely important, but it's not the only consideration that you have for SEO. It's something you need to get right for sure. You need to target this correctly, but there's other additional SEO considerations we need to look at. And on that next slide here, we have a list of items that are essential for your SEO. Let's start. Perform local keyword research. Do not translate your keywords. Just do this locally. Get your content professionally translated by an LSD, and then also get your metadata, like the page titles, page description translated, and then optimize your landing pages with those. You do need to still build appropriate local backlinks. This is still the main signal that Google uses to rank your site, so it's important also for local. Make sure you don't get hit with duplicate content, especially if you're having multi versions of the same language maybe. So you can use things like hreflang and rel canonical to help this. Avoid mixing strategies for URL. It's really tough from an SEO perspective if you're using a country code top level domain on one end, but then you use a generic one with subfolders somewhere else, and then maybe a sub domain even, right? It's not easy to deal with. So pick something consistent there. For end user usability, translate your URLs if possible. Like here's an example with Skype. Now Skype does not do it this way. I just made it up. This is how they should do it on their About page if done correctly. And then also give users a choice, an easy way to switch country or language. Lastly, make sure that you target your URLs correctly with Google Console. And on the next slide, we see where I talked about this a few times already. So here, this is the area where you go in Google Console to pick your region if you use a generic domain, for example here. All right. Another consideration here is hreflang. So very important for international SEO. It's specific to Google only. Here at this stage, let me also name, I keep saying Google, but of course there's also Bing, there's other considerations, Baidu in China, Yandex in Russia. So you need to, of course, satisfy all of these. I mainly talk about Google as the biggest, but other search engines have similar tools. They usually follow what Google and Bing does. So hreflang, let's just define what this is briefly. Assuming you have a multilingual website and you have a set of the same pages but in different languages, right? Maybe you have, just like the Skype example, you have an About page in English and an About page in German. So hreflang signals to Google which language you're using on a specific page, and this helps the search engine show the appropriate localized version to your users when they perform a search in this language. So if you have the same content but in multiple languages, your About page in German and your About page in English, you want to use hreflang. Or similarly, if you have content that's aimed at different regions in the same language, let's say product description page in English, but you're targeting the US, Canada, and maybe Australia. You want to use hreflang to tell Google what belongs where. So in essence, hreflang does not help you increase your rankings directly. The goal is to serve the right content to the right user. On the next slide, we show what the format looks like. again highlight the mistakes here. It's a very misused tag, unfortunately. The one thing I want to say here is you have two options. You can do, like I show on this example, you could put this hreflang code inside the page template in the header of the HTML, or you could create a separate XML sitemap for it. If you imagine you have 30,000 products, 30,000 SKUs, no way you can put this into the template here. You want to use not just one sitemap, probably you want to use a index of different sitemaps altogether there for it. All right, Google helps us with this hreflang. On the next slide, we'll see where this happens. It's again the same area in Google Search Console where you can see if you have any errors with this, for example. All right, so targeting optimization. So now that we talked about how do we satisfy the user, the search engine, we need to also talk about how do we make sure that the user has an easy way of switching or picking country. The three primary ways, again, is we could use a country coded top level domain, number one. Number two, we could say, okay, we're looking, where is this user coming from? Depending on the IP, we could either auto-direct them or at least make a suggestion to what country or language might be appropriate. And then third, give the user a choice through a global gateway to make a pick. And the global gateway is really all it is. It's a mechanism to allow the visitor to easily navigate to their locally appropriate content from any given page on your website. There's a few components to this. Usually there's a trigger icon or a trigger word that you can use to open up usually a selection. And here we see an example on this page, a splash screen that uses country selector broken by region and then indicating with a country flag and a country name your choice. On the next slide, we see this is again coming from our research on the 1,000 Forbes companies, what a country trigger might look like here. And the most common one, also the one we recommend for the icon, for the trigger icon, would be the globe, used 18% of the time here. Once people hit this trigger and they see the list of choices, which you see below here in the second row, the country selector, English country name only is fairly common. Also flag plus country name is common. We recommend maybe the one on the right there where the country name or the language, if you will, actually is translated into the native language that the user understands. On the next slide, we see the same, but for language targeting. Here, similar, sometimes we have a trigger. Sometimes if there's maybe only two languages, there might not even be a trigger, just might be two options there. Short code is quite popular, 23%. The flag and the language name in English or in local is popular. Again, below in the list of selections, it's a short code and language name that is very commonly used. Do not use the flag to indicate language. That's a bad idea. We can use flag for country maybe, but not to indicate language. So where do we place the trigger? We looked at this as well on our study, and in the next slide we'll see a breakdown here. Essentially, put it in the top right. That's where users most is expected for both country or language selection. All right, and then I'm running low on time, so I'm gonna finish my part of the presentation here with just looking at a couple of examples. So here we have a Chinese company, and I met these guys at a trade show in Munich, Germany, and these guys are exhibiting there. They're flying their whole team there. They're spending money on a booth, and then 1 week in Germany. They're trying to break into the European market, and guess what? Their website is only in Chinese. So when you embark on this mission of expanding and finding these global users, you have to commit, and you have to make sure that you localize and translate your marketing materials on your website. Else you're gonna be having a hard time with this. Another example on the next slide is another Chinese business here. Now, they do actually provide a language option. However, unless you speak Chinese, it's very hard to know where to go to get to your language, right? So they tried, but they just didn't execute it in a way. If they at least would give me a globe or an indicator of something, then I might be able to find it, but not like this. Again, next example, Spanish firm. This is a global Forbes 1000 company here. Yes, they have a language option, but only if you speak Spanish will you be able to know where to go to choose. All right, that concludes more or less my part here, and I'm going to hand it over to Matt.
Thank you, Florian. I know we're running short on time. Just to do a time check, it's 1:56. I'll go over some key takeaways. We'll look at the questions. We'll see if we can get to any of them. I know we'll take care of all of the questions and respond to everyone via email after the webinar if we run out of time. But just to recap, we talked today about why you would build a multilingual website, how you would address language and country targeting, evaluating different CMS systems, building and maintaining global brand consistency, SEO and search considerations, and different user experience options. I'm going to pull up the questions and let's see. I'm actually not seeing, there they are. Okay. How much does it cost to translate my site into different languages? That's a great question and is typically driven by a couple of different factors. One is the size of your website, the number of words. So that's something we can certainly take a look at. If you're interested in understanding how many words your site has, we can look at various different elements of it and give you a word count. And then also the number of languages. It's a lot less expensive to translate one language than it is to translate, say, 10 or 15. And it does move proportionately. So we can certainly help dive further into that and give people a sense of the number of words on their site and the cost, overall cost per language. But we would need to know those two factors as well as a couple of other factors, like how we would get files back and forth, or redoing the QA or you doing the QA, and a few other elements. Then another question is, can I just use Google Translate to translate my site for my users? Certainly, of course. You can go to Google, you can get a plugin for your website, and you can use Google Translate. But if you're using your site to sell your business, which is what the majority of customers who come to Acclaro use their website for, it's really the face of your brand. You wouldn't use a machine to create the English content on the site, and you have to think of the multilingual content the same way. It's selling you, even if it's not specifically selling a product, even if it's not an e-commerce site and you don't have a shopping cart, but it's more of a an agency or a service and people are just using it for informational purposes. The most surefire way to get someone to leave your site quickly is to have a poorly translated site or have language on the site that offends them. And when you're using Google Translate, you really don't know what you're getting. You don't know you've made a mistake or you've offended someone until they tell you. And 9 times out of 10, they're not going to tell you. They're just going to navigate away from your site and go to one of your competitors. I think we'll end it there because we're at 1:59 and I want to be cognizant of people who have 2 o'clock calls. There are a number of other questions and we will respond to those via email. Thank you everyone for your time today and we appreciate you joining.